It is the fall of 1780, and Banastre Tarleton, the most feared cavalry officer in the British Army, is riding his exhausted dragoons through a South Carolina swamp at a dead pace, chasing a man he has never actually seen. Tarleton is 26 years old, stocky, aggressive, and already infamous on both sides for a ruthlessness that shows no particular preference between rebel and loyalist. Marion himself would later say of him, "He spares neither Whig nor Tory," and he meant it as a warning, not a compliment. For 26 miles, through mud, black water, and tangled cypress roots, Tarleton has pushed his men harder than almost any pursuit of the entire war. And for 26 miles, the man he is chasing has simply disappeared deeper into the swamp every time Tarleton gets close. Finally, soaked, furious, and out of options, Tarleton gives up the chase. He turns his exhausted column around and reportedly says the line that will follow this man for the rest of his life. "As for this damned old fox, the devil himself could not catch him." The British had just given Francis Marion his nickname. They would spend the next year discovering exactly how badly they had underestimated the small, limping planter they were chasing. To understand why a middle-aged rice planter with almost no formal military training became the single most dangerous man in South Carolina, you have to understand how completely the American cause had fallen apart in the South by the summer of 1780. On May 12th, Charleston fell. It was, by most measures, the worst American defeat of the entire Revolutionary War. Nearly 5,500 Continental soldiers surrendered in a single afternoon, along with their weapons, their artillery, and effectively the entire organized American military presence in the state. British General Charles Cornwallis now controlled the ports, the roads, and every major town in South Carolina. Loyalist militia, emboldened by the collapse, began terrorizing patriot families across the countryside, burning farms and settling old scores under the cover of war. Within 3 weeks of the surrender, British garrisons occupied a chain of posts running from Augusta on the Savannah River, northward through Rocky Mount and Camden, and eastward to Georgetown on the coast, without having to fire a shot to do it. Then in August, at the Battle of Camden, the situation got even worse. A Continental force under General Horatio Gates was routed so completely that American militia fled the field in panic, some running for 15 miles without stopping. Baron DeKalb, one of Gates's senior officers, was killed on the field, and roughly 150 Maryland Continentals were taken prisoner. South Carolina, for all practical purposes, was a British colony again. There was no organized Continental Army left standing anywhere in the state. What there was, instead, was Francis Marion, a man most of Cornwallis's officers had never even heard of. Marion's survival was, in its own way, the first accident that made everything else possible. Weeks before Charleston fell, Marion was attending a dinner party at the Charleston home of a fellow officer. Following 18th century custom, the host had locked the doors while the guests worked their way through a long series of toasts to the American cause. Marion, who by most accounts was not a drinking man, felt trapped in the room and climbed out through a second-floor window to escape the party. The fall shattered his ankle badly enough that he had to leave the city to recover at a relative's plantation in the countryside. It was an almost embarrassing injury for a soldier to carry into a war. It was also the reason he was not in Charleston when it surrendered, and the reason he was not among the thousands of Continental officers captured that May. Physically, Marion did not look like the man who would soon terrify British regulars across the state. He was small, slight, walked with a permanent limp from the ankle that never fully healed, and by most descriptions had little formal education and an awkward, difficult manner with fellow officers. He had fought against the Cherokee in the 1760s, learning firsthand how a smaller force could use terrain, concealment, and ambush against a conventional enemy, and he had served competently in the defense of Charleston and at the failed siege of Savannah in 1779, but nothing in his record suggested he was about to become one of the most effective guerrilla commanders in American military history. When General Horatio Gates arrived in the South to take command of what remained of the Continental Army, he assigned Marion a task that most other officers would have considered a demotion: go into the swamps of the Williamsburg district and see what could be organized out of the scattered militia hiding there. Gates, by several accounts, did not think particularly highly of Marion and mainly wanted him out of the way. What he got back would help save the entire Southern war effort. The men Marion found were not soldiers in any conventional sense. They were farmers, escaped prisoners, and militia who had scattered after Camden and simply never gone home. His band usually numbered somewhere between 20 and 70 men, occasionally swelling past 100 for a specific raid before shrinking back down as men returned home to their farms between operations. They had almost no uniforms. Many carried their own hunting rifles instead of standard muskets, and most supplied their own horses. Ammunition was scarce enough that men were melting down pewter plates and cups to cast their own bullets. One of Marion's own men, traveling with him throughout this period, was an enslaved man named Oscar, who cooked for the camp, mended clothing and equipment, and by most accounts was present for raids alongside the rest of the band, though like most enslaved men who served in the war, almost nothing was formally recorded about his own experience of it. Marion rarely commanded more than a few dozen to a couple hundred men at any given time, and he understood something the British consistently failed to grasp. He did not need an army. He needed speed, terrain, and the willingness to vanish the moment a fight stopped favoring him. The swamps of the PD and Santee River basins were, to a British regular, nearly impassable. Waist-deep black water, cypress knees, and a maze of channels that shifted with the seasons. To Marion and his men, who had hunted and fished this country their entire lives, it was simply home. Every swamp camp he used had at least 2, and usually 3, separate escape routes, and Marion changed his camp location constantly, sometimes moving every single night specifically so that no informant could ever report his position with any confidence. On August 20th, 1780, just days after the disaster at Camden, Marion executed the raid that put him on Cornwallis's radar for the first time. Gates had originally ordered Marion to range along the Santee River burning boats to cut communication between Camden and Charleston, and Marion was in the middle of that assignment when he learned of the defeat. He kept the news from his own 60 men and continued the work. Shortly afterward, a deserter brought him word that a British captain named Roberts, with an escort of around 90 men, was holding roughly 150 captured Maryland Continentals near Nelson's Ferry on the Santee, prisoners taken just days earlier at Camden. Marion, with a force smaller than the group of prisoners he was trying to free, ambushed the column near the ferry crossing. The guard force was overwhelmed and scattered before it could mount an organized defense. All 150 prisoners were freed. In the middle of the worst month of the entire war for the American cause, Marion had just handed the Continental Army back over 100 fighting men, and he had done it with almost no losses of his own. Cornwallis, understandably, was furious. A local militia commander with a few dozen men had just humiliated a supply column in territory the British considered fully secured. He needed this problem dealt with, and he knew exactly which officer to send. Cornwallis dispatched Banastre Tarleton, along with a substantial detachment of dragoons and infantry, reported at well over 1,000 men, with orders to hunt Marion down and end the problem permanently. Tarleton had a reputation for speed and ruthlessness that had already terrified militia across the Carolinas, and he brought that same aggression into the swamps specifically to run Marion's much smaller band into the ground. What followed was the 26-mile chase through swamp country that opened this video. Tarleton pushed his men hard, following what he believed was a closing gap, only to watch Marion's force melt into terrain that Tarleton's cavalry simply could not effectively operate in. Horses that performed beautifully on open ground became a liability in waist-deep water and root-tangled undergrowth. Marion, for his part, had anticipated exactly this kind of response. He had already sent one of his officers, Major James, on a separate mission to snatch a British soldier for questioning specifically, so he would know if a large force was being organized against him. By the time Tarleton's column actually set out, Marion already knew roughly how badly he was outnumbered, and had broken camp for the safety of the Great White Marsh across the North Carolina border before the chase even properly began. Eventually, exhausted, soaked, and no closer to Marion than when he started, Tarleton called off the pursuit. The line he reportedly said afterward, comparing the chase to hunting a fox that the devil himself could not catch, spread quickly through both armies. Marion had a nickname now. More importantly, he had proof that his entire strategy worked. The British could not fight him on his own terrain, and every time they tried, they wasted resources, exhausted their men, and accomplished nothing. If you are learning something from this breakdown, take a second and hit subscribe. We cover overlooked battles and tactics like this every week, and Marion's story is only getting more interesting from here. Marion did not simply hide after embarrassing Tarleton. On his way back from North Carolina, he stopped along the route recruiting new men, rebuilding the very force Tarleton had just spent days failing to destroy. On September 28th, at a place called Black Mingo, Marion caught a loyalist militia force under Colonel John Cumming Ball camped near a bridge, and struck at night, scattering them and capturing supplies, horses, and Ball's own saddle, which Marion reportedly rode for the rest of the war. Then on October 25th, at Tearcoat Swamp, Marion learned that another loyalist militia force, around 200 men under Colonel Samuel Tynes, was camped nearby, confident enough in their position that they had not bothered posting a serious guard. Marion gathered roughly 150 of his own men and launched a night attack directly into the camp. The result was close to a rout. Tynes's men, caught completely by surprise in the dark, scattered in confusion, and Marion's forces captured around 80 horses along with muskets and supplies, badly needed equipment for a force that had been improvising its logistics from the very beginning. There was one lesson from this fight that Marion took seriously going forward. During the chaos of the attack, the noise of his own men's horses had nearly given away their approach before they reached the camp. From that point on, Marion reportedly had his men muffle their horses' hooves for night raids, wrapping cloth or hide around them to keep the approach silent. It was a small, almost domestic detail, wet cloth wrapped around a horse's foot, but it was exactly the kind of practical, adaptive thinking that separated Marion from officers trained only in conventional European tactics. There is one story from this period of the war that has outlived almost everything else about Marion, even though historians are honestly skeptical of exactly how it happened. As the story is usually told, a British officer arrived at Marion's swamp camp near Snow Island under a flag of truce to negotiate a prisoner exchange, and was blindfolded on the way in so he could not learn the route through the swamp. When the business was concluded, Marion invited him to share a meal, which turned out to be sweet potatoes roasted in the campfire ashes and served on a piece of bark, with water or watered vinegar to drink, prepared by Oscar. According to the legend that grew up around the story afterward, the British officer was so struck by the plainness of the meal and the fact that Marion's men served without pay or proper supply, fighting for a cause rather than a wage, that he went back to Charleston and resigned his commission rather than keep fighting men like that. Whether that ending is true is doubtful, and the story was popularized decades later in a wildly embellished early biography of Marion that took considerable liberties with the facts. But the story stuck for a reason. Whatever actually happened at that meeting, it captured something real about the contrast between a professional army used to proper rations and quarters, and a militia that was, quite literally, living out of the swamp on whatever it could scrape together. By December of 1780, Marion's reputation had grown enough that South Carolina's exiled governor, John Rutledge, operating a government in exile with almost no formal authority left on the ground, commissioned Marion as a brigadier general of state militia. It was a title with very little real institutional backing behind it. There was no supply depot, no regular pay, no formal chain of command feeding him reinforcements. What Marion had instead was a growing reputation, a network of scouts and informants throughout the swamp country who kept him informed of British and Loyalist movements days ahead of when regular forces would have known, and an increasingly demoralized set of Loyalist militia units who had learned to dread the mere possibility that Marion's brigade might be nearby. When Nathanael Greene arrived in the South in late 1780 to take over command of what remained of the Continental War effort, he inherited an almost impossible situation, badly outnumbered, poorly supplied, facing a British army that had just crushed two major Continental forces in a matter of months. Greene needed exactly what Marion had already spent half a year proving he could deliver, a force that could harass, delay, and bleed the British without needing to win a conventional battle to matter. And unlike Thomas Sumter, another partisan commander operating in the same theater, Marion proved willing to actually coordinate his operations with Greene's broader strategy rather than fighting purely on his own terms. That coordination paid off directly in the spring of 1781. Working alongside Lieutenant Colonel Henry, Lee's Continental Cavalry Legion, Marion laid siege to and captured Fort Watson on the Santee River in April, using an improvised log tower built specifically to fire down into the fort's defenses, followed by the capture of Fort Mott in May. Together, these actions helped force the British to abandon Camden itself, one of their most important interior strongholds in the entire state. The engagement that best demonstrates what Marion had built on his own came on August 30th, 1781, at a crossing called Parker's Ferry. British cavalry, moving to reinforce garrisons and screen supply routes, needed to cross a narrow causeway bordered by dense marsh on both sides. Marion recognized the terrain for exactly what it was, a kill zone, if he could get his men into position before the British arrived. He positioned his forces along the causeway, hidden in the marsh grass on both sides, and waited. When the British column entered the crossing, strung out along the narrow road with no ability to maneuver off to either side, Marion's men opened fire from concealed positions at close range. The British cavalry, trapped on a road barely wide enough for a handful of horses across, with swamp on both sides preventing any real counterformation, took catastrophic losses in a matter of minutes. By the time the survivors managed to withdraw, the British had suffered somewhere in the range of 125 men killed and another 80 wounded. Marion's own losses were reportedly 1 man killed and 3 wounded. It is one of the most lopsided engagements of the entire Southern campaign, and it happened because Marion understood something Tarleton and nearly every other British officer in the theater never fully adjusted to. In this terrain, against this enemy, the ambush was not a supporting tactic. It was the entire strategy. The timing of Parker's Ferry mattered as much as the casualty count. The engagement badly damaged British cavalry strength just 9 days before the Battle of Eutaw Springs on September 8th, one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the entire Southern campaign, and the first time since the failed siege of Savannah in 1779 that Marion found himself fighting in a formal, conventional battle rather than a hit-and-run raid. Greene placed Marion in command of the right wing of his front line, alongside Brigadier General Andrew Pickens. British forces at Eutaw Springs, already worn down by a year of exactly the kind of harassment Marion and other partisan commanders had inflicted across the state, technically held the field by the end of the day, but their losses were so severe that they abandoned their remaining interior outposts shortly afterward and pulled back toward Charleston, effectively ending large-scale British operations in the Carolina interior for the rest of the war. Greene, in his own writings, credited partisan commanders like Marion with something no single battlefield victory could have provided on its own: the ability to keep an army in the field, exhaust an enemy's resources, and disrupt supply and reinforcement continuously, even while losing most of the large, formal engagements of the campaign. By the time Cornwallis marched north into Virginia in 1781, chasing an increasingly elusive American strategy across the South, the British had already spent over a year discovering that South Carolina's swamps belonged to Francis Marion, not to them. Every soldier tied up hunting him, every supply column he intercepted, every loyalist militia unit that hesitated to patrol a road because Marion's brigade might be waiting nearby, was a resource the British desperately needed elsewhere. That road north eventually led to Yorktown. The swamps along the Santee and PD rivers look much the same today as they did in 1780, dense, quiet, and easy to underestimate from a distance. Several of Marion's campsites are marked today at what is now the Francis Marion National Forest in South Carolina, roughly 250,000 acres of the same terrain he used to disappear from pursuers for an entire year. Standing at the edge of that water, it is easy to understand why a British cavalry officer, trained for open-field European warfare, had no real answer for a man who refused to fight on those terms until the terms finally favored him. Marion spent most of the war avoiding the kind of pitched battle that made careers and reputations, and when he finally did stand in a formal line at Eutaw Springs, it was on his own terms, backed by a year of exactly the kind of ambushes, night raids, and vanishing acts that had already broken the will of every force sent to stop him. He proved that a war does not have to be won in a single decisive stroke. Sometimes it is one freed column of prisoners, one muffled hoofbeat in the dark, and one exhausted pursuing army at a time, until the enemy simply runs out of will to keep chasing a man the devil himself could not catch. If this kind of overlooked history is your thing, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one, and leave a comment telling us which forgotten commander or battle you want us to cover.